A heavy silence settled across the Whitmore Foundation gala as Richard Whitmore stood frozen in front of Olivia Carter, his eyes locked on the small ring resting in her hand. The music from the orchestra continued somewhere in the distance, but it felt distant, almost underwater, as if reality itself had slowed down around them. Olivia did not look away. Her voice, though soft, carried a certainty that cut through the tension in the room. "You always said you would come back for it," she said, her words simple but loaded with something no one else in the room seemed to understand. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or something far deeper. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in anger but in recognition of something he had spent years trying to forget. "That ring does not belong in your hands," he said carefully, as if choosing each word was the only thing keeping him composed. Olivia lowered the ring slightly but did not let it go. "It was inside the box you threw away," she repeated, her tone steady. "I did not take it from anywhere else. I found it exactly where you left it." A faint ripple of unease moved through the surrounding guests. Richard's assistant stepped closer again, whispering urgently that they should leave the floor, but he raised a hand without looking at her. His focus never left the child. For a brief moment, his gaze drifted, as if the room itself had dissolved into something else entirely. A memory, half-formed and uninvited, flickered behind his eyes. A woman laughing softly in a quiet room, sunlight falling across a table, and a promise spoken in a tone he had once believed would never fade. He blinked, forcing himself back into the present. "Where did you hear about that box?" he asked again, this time slower, more controlled. Olivia tilted her head slightly. "I did not hear about it," she said. "I saw it." Richard frowned faintly. "You saw it?" She nodded. "In the storage room at the old property. The one nobody uses anymore." That detail made something inside him shift. Very few people even knew about that place anymore. The room seemed to grow heavier, as if every person in it was unconsciously holding their breath. Olivia took one small step forward again, closing the distance that everyone else seemed afraid to cross. "There were other things in there too," she added quietly. "Pictures, letters. But this ring, this one felt different." Richard's jaw tightened again, but his voice softened without permission. "Different how?" Olivia hesitated for the first time, glancing down at the ring before looking back up at him. "It felt like it was waiting," she said. The words landed with unexpected weight. A few guests exchanged uncertain looks, while others simply watched, unable to turn away. Richard's gaze dropped briefly to the ring again, and when it did, something in his posture changed almost imperceptibly. The controlled distance he always maintained began to fracture in small, invisible ways. "Who are you, Olivia?" he asked once more, quieter than before. This time, she did not answer immediately. Instead, she simply held his gaze, as if deciding whether he was finally ready to hear the truth she had been carrying far longer than anyone in that room could imagine. The air inside the Whitmore Foundation gala felt heavier as Olivia Carter continued to hold Richard Whitmore's gaze without flinching, the small ring still resting carefully in her palm as if it carried a weight far beyond its size. The surrounding guests remained silent now, their earlier curiosity replaced by a growing sense that something deeply personal was unfolding in front of them. Richard finally exhaled slowly, his composure still intact on the surface but clearly strained underneath. "Olivia," he said again, softer this time, as if lowering his voice might make the truth less sharp. "If you know something, you need to tell me clearly." For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes drifting down toward the ring. Then she carefully turned it over between her fingers. Under the chandelier light, a faint engraving became visible along the inner band, worn but still readable enough to shift the entire atmosphere in the room. Richard's expression changed instantly the moment he saw it. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. A faint tightening in his jaw suggested recognition before he even allowed himself to fully acknowledge it. One of the guests leaned forward slightly, trying to see what had caused the sudden shift in his demeanor, but no one dared to interrupt. Olivia stepped closer again, closing the gap between them until she was standing just a few feet away. "You remember this?" she said quietly, not as a question but as a statement. Richard's assistant moved in closer once more, clearly unsettled, whispering that they should end the conversation immediately, but Richard did not respond. His attention was no longer in the room. It was somewhere else entirely, pulled backward through years he had carefully sealed away. The engraving on the ring triggered something buried deep inside him, something tied not to business or public reputation, but to a moment he had long convinced himself no longer mattered. A memory surfaced in fragments, a quieter place, a different version of himself, and a promise spoken under circumstances that now felt distant yet unmistakably real. He blinked, forcing himself back into the present again, his voice lower than before. "Where did you get this ring, Olivia?" he asked, each word measured. Olivia did not look away. "I told you," she said gently. "I found it in the old box you threw away." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion of her honesty, but in conflict with what he was beginning to feel. "That is not possible," he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it once carried. "That box was locked away years ago." Olivia tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words carefully. "It was not locked to me," she replied. The simplicity of her answer made several guests exchange uneasy glances. Richard's posture shifted subtly, his shoulders no longer as rigid as before. The control he had maintained so carefully at the beginning of the evening was beginning to fracture in ways that were not visible to most, but unmistakable to those watching closely. Olivia lifted the ring again, holding it between them like a bridge neither of them had expected to cross. "There is something else inside the box," she added quietly. Richard frowned slightly. "Something else?" She nodded once. "Letters," she said, "and a photograph of someone you used to know." At that moment, Richard's expression changed completely. Not dramatically, not outwardly, but in the quiet collapse of certainty behind his eyes. The room around him remained still, but inside him something long buried had finally begun to surface, and for the first time since the evening began, he did not immediately know how to stop it. The tension inside the Whitmore Foundation Gala had shifted from quiet confusion to something far more fragile, as if every person in the room was now holding their breath without realizing it. Richard Whitmore stood facing Olivia Carter, his eyes still fixed on the ring, but his attention was no longer entirely on the object itself. It was on her, on the way she stood so calmly in front of him, as if she already knew the weight of what she had brought into this moment. Behind him, his assistant stepped forward again, her voice low but urgent as she tried to pull him back into control. "Mr. Whitmore, we need to handle this privately," she said carefully, glancing at the watching guests who were beginning to whisper among themselves. But Richard did not move. Olivia lowered the ring slightly but kept it visible, her voice steady when she spoke again. "You are not answering because you remember it," she said, not accusing but stating it as if it were simply the truth waiting to be accepted. Richard's jaw tightened, and for the first time that night, he broke eye contact with her, looking down at the polished floor as though searching for stability there. "That ring," he began slowly, then paused as if reconsidering the rest of the sentence, "was part of something that ended a long time ago." Olivia did not respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer again, closing the gap between them until she was standing directly in front of him. The room seemed to react to her movement, a faint ripple of anticipation passing through the guests. "It did not end," she said quietly. "It was left behind." A murmur spread through the ballroom, but no one dared to speak loudly enough to interrupt. Richard finally looked at her again, and this time, his expression had changed. Not anger, not denial, but something far more complex. Something that made him appear less like the powerful figure everyone in the room knew and more like a man standing at the edge of something he had spent years avoiding. "Olivia," he said again, his voice lower, "where did you really find that box?" She did not hesitate. "In a place where things are kept when people do not want to remember them," she answered. The simplicity of her words seemed to land heavier than anything else said that evening. Richard's assistant stepped in again, more firmly this time. "Sir," This is becoming disruptive. We should end this interaction now. But Richard raised his hand slightly without turning around, signaling her to stop. The gesture alone silenced her. Olivia watched him carefully, her grip on the ring unwavering. "You told someone once that you would never forget," she said softly. "But you did." That sentence struck something deeper than the others. Richard inhaled slowly, his posture tightening, as if he were holding back a response he was not ready to give. For a brief moment, the noise of the gala, the presence of the guests, even the grandeur of the hall seemed to fade into something distant. All that remained was the ring, the child in front of him, and a past he could no longer fully separate from the present. "I do not know what you think you found," he said carefully, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "But you cannot come here and rewrite things you do not understand." Olivia's expression did not change. "I am not rewriting anything," she replied. "I am returning it." The word lingered in the air, heavier than anything else spoken so far. Richard looked at her for a long moment, and in that silence, something inside him shifted again, not fully breaking, but no longer completely intact. For the first time, he did not have a response ready, and the absence of one was more revealing than anything he could have said. The atmosphere inside the Whitmore Foundation Gala had completely changed, as if the room itself no longer belonged to celebration but to something far more fragile and uncertain. Richard Whitmore stood, motionless in front of Olivia Carter, his attention no longer divided between the guests, the music, or the luxury surrounding him. Everything had narrowed to the small ring in her hand and the way she continued to hold it with quiet certainty. Behind him, his assistant made another attempt to intervene, her voice controlled but increasingly tense. "Mr. Whitmore, the board members are asking if you are continuing your remarks," she said carefully, trying to pull him back into the structure of the evening. But Richard did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on Olivia, who now seemed less like a child standing in a room full of powerful adults, and more like the only person who understood something he had long stopped confronting. The surrounding guests began to shift subtly, their earlier curiosity now replaced by discomfort, as though they were witnessing a conversation that was never meant to be public. Olivia took a small step back, then looked down at the ring again before speaking. "You are not listening to me?" she said quietly, her voice steady but firm. Richard exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried more weight than sound. "I am listening," he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I am just trying to understand how a child ended up with something that does not belong in this room." Olivia lifted her gaze to meet his again. "It belongs here because it belongs to you," she said. The sentence landed with immediate silence. Even the faint background music seemed to hesitate for a moment. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in anger but in conflict. He finally took a small step back, as if distance might help him regain control of what was slipping through his understanding. "This conversation is over," he said calmly, though it lacked conviction. He turned slightly toward his assistant, signaling for the situation to be managed privately, away from the audience. But before anyone could move, Olivia spoke again. "You cannot leave this behind again," she said, her voice still soft but carrying a clarity that cut through the formal air of the room. That single sentence made Richard pause mid-step. The guests, sensing the shift, remained frozen, their attention now fully locked on the exchange. For a brief moment, Richard looked like he might continue walking away, but something in his posture changed. The controlled distance he always maintained in public began to fracture in ways only visible to those watching closely. He turned back slowly, his gaze returning to Olivia. "Where are you supposed to be right now?" he asked, not as a dismissal, but as a question that carried genuine confusion. Olivia did not answer immediately. Instead, she held the ring up again, letting it catch the light one more time. "I am where this led me," she said simply. Richard's assistant stepped forward again, more urgently now. "Sir, we should move this to a private room," she insisted. But Richard raised his hand once more, stopping her without looking away from Olivia. The gesture was sharper this time, and the assistant stepped back immediately. The room fell into a deeper silence, as if even the smallest sound might disrupt something irreversible unfolding in front of them. Richard looked down briefly, then back at Olivia, his voice lowering. "You said there were letters," he said carefully. Olivia nodded once. "There are more than letters," she replied. That answer shifted something again in the air between them. Richard's expression changed subtly, not into recognition yet, but into something closer to uncertainty mixed with reluctant awareness. He looked at the ring once more, then at the child holding it, and for the first time since the evening began, he did not immediately know how to control what was happening next. The silence inside the Whitmore Foundation Gala had become heavier than the chandeliers above, as if the entire room was waiting for Richard Whitmore to make a decision that would define more than just the evening. Olivia Carter still stood in front of him, holding the ring carefully as though it was not just an object but a key to something neither of them fully controlled yet. Richard finally broke his gaze away for a brief moment, looking toward his assistant as if trying to anchor himself back into the structure of his own world. "Bring me a private room," he said calmly, though his voice carried a strain that had not been there before. The assistant hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded and immediately motioned toward a side corridor reserved for executives and private discussions. The guests in the ballroom remained silent as Richard began to move, not because they were instructed to follow, but because no one wanted to miss what was now clearly no longer a simple interruption. Olivia followed him without hesitation, her small footsteps echoing faintly against the polished floor. As they entered the private room just off the main hall, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The space was quieter, more controlled, lined with glass walls that still reflected the glow of the gala outside, but separated them from it, just enough to feel removed from the spectacle. Richard turned to face Olivia again, his expression more restrained now, but far less certain than before. "You said there were letters," he said, his voice lower, more deliberate. Olivia nodded once. "There are many," she replied. Richard paused, then slowly sat down at the edge of a long polished table, as if grounding himself physically would help him process what was unfolding. His assistant remained near the doorway, visibly tense, waiting for instruction. "Where did you see them?" Richard asked. Olivia looked down at the ring again, then back up at him. "In the same place as the box," she said. "A storage room that nobody enters anymore. It is not locked, just forgotten." That word landed differently. Forgotten. Richard repeated it silently in his mind, as if testing its weight. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together, his usual composure replaced by something more reflective. "Who showed you that room?" he asked. Olivia hesitated for the first time. "No one showed me," she said. "I found it because I was looking for something that belonged to someone who never came back." The assistant shifted slightly at the doorway but remained silent. Richard exhaled slowly, then looked toward the glass wall, where the gala still continued in the distance, laughter and music faintly visible but no longer connected to him. "This is not possible," he said quietly, though the certainty in his voice had already begun to fade. Olivia stepped closer to the table and gently placed the ring down in front of him. "It is possible," she said, "because it already happened." Richard stared at the ring for a long moment without speaking. The engraving he had tried not to recognize earlier now felt impossible to ignore. Slowly, he reached out but stopped just before touching it, as if unsure whether contact would confirm everything he had been avoiding. Behind him, his assistant finally spoke. "Sir, if this is related to the old property records, we can have legal review begin immediately," she said carefully. But Richard did not respond. His attention remained fixed on Olivia. "Why are you here now?" he asked her quietly. Olivia met his eyes without hesitation. "Because you finally opened the box again," she said. The room fell into a stillness so complete that even the distant sound of the gala seemed to disappear. For the first time since the evening began, Richard Whitmore did not have a response, and in that absence, something long buried beneath years of control and silence began to surface, slowly and unmistakably, as if the past itself had finally found its way back into the present. The private room inside the Whitmore Foundation Gala had fallen into a silence so dense that even the distant sounds of laughter and music outside felt like they belonged to another world entirely. Richard Whitmore stood near the long glass table, his gaze still fixed on the ring resting between him and Olivia Carter, as if it had become something far more significant than a piece of jewelry. The reflection of the chandelier lights shimmered faintly across its surface, and for a moment, Richard did not speak. Olivia remained still on the opposite side of the table, her small hands now empty but her presence unchanged, steady and unwavering. Finally, Richard exhaled slowly and broke the silence. "You keep saying I opened something," he said carefully, his voice controlled but no longer firm in the way it had been earlier. Olivia looked at him directly. "You did," she replied simply. Behind him, his assistant stood near the doorway, visibly unsettled, glancing between them as if trying to determine whether to intervene again or remain silent. Richard did not turn around. Instead, he pulled his attention fully back to Olivia. "If what you are saying is true," he said slowly, "then you understand what you are asking me to do." Olivia nodded once. "I am not asking you to do anything," she said. "I am only showing you what you already left behind." The words lingered in the air between them. Richard looked down at the ring again, this time longer, allowing himself to focus on the engraving he had instinctively avoided earlier. His expression tightened slightly, not in resistance but in recognition that he could no longer dismiss what was in front of him. "You should not have had access to that place," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Olivia stepped a little closer to the table. "I did not need permission," she said. "I needed answers." That sentence shifted the atmosphere again. The assistant finally stepped forward half a step, speaking carefully. "Sir, if there are legal or historical matters involved, we should proceed through proper channels," she said. But Richard raised a hand slightly without looking at her, signaling her to stop. She hesitated, then remained silent. Olivia reached into the small bag she had been carrying and placed a folded piece of paper on the table next to the ring. Richard looked at it but did not touch it immediately. "What is this?" he asked. "One of them," Olivia said. "From the box." Richard stared at the paper for a long moment before slowly unfolding it. His movements were measured, as if even the act of opening it might change something irreversible. As the paper opened, his eyes scanned the handwriting. The room did not move, did not sound, as if the world itself was waiting for his reaction. His expression shifted subtly, not into shock, but into something far more complicated, something that carried weight that had been building long before this moment. He lowered the paper slightly but did not let it go. "Where did you learn to read these?" he asked quietly. Olivia answered without hesitation. "I did not learn," she said. "I recognized them." Richard looked up at her again, and for the first time, his voice softened in a way that was almost unintentional. "Recognized them from where?" Olivia met his gaze steadily. "From someone who used to wait for you," she said. The silence that followed was no longer just tension. It was recognition beginning to form in places Richard had long since buried. He slowly set the paper down next to the ring, his hand lingering just above the table for a moment before pulling back. Behind him, the assistant finally stopped moving altogether, sensing that whatever was unfolding could no longer be redirected or contained. Richard Whitmore remained standing in front of Olivia Carter, no longer fully in control of the situation, and for the first time since the gala began, he understood that the truth was not arriving all at once, but piece by piece, refusing to be ignored any longer. The private room inside the Whitmore Foundation gala felt even smaller now, as if the walls themselves had shifted closer after Richard Whitmore read the letter placed beside the ring. The sound of the distant orchestra outside was now barely noticeable, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to concentrate entirely around the glass table where the past had begun to surface piece by piece. Olivia Carter stood on the opposite side, watching Richard carefully, her expression calm but attentive, as if she already knew that the next few seconds would matter more than anything that had happened so far. Richard slowly lowered the letter back onto the table, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary before letting go completely. His eyes remained fixed on the handwriting, then shifted to Olivia again. There was a subtle change in his expression now, not dramatic but undeniable, as though something long buried had started to align itself into a shape he could no longer ignore. "You said you recognized them," he said quietly, referring to the letters. Olivia nodded once without hesitation. "Yes," she replied, "because I have seen them before." Behind Richard, his assistant stood completely still now, no longer attempting to intervene, her earlier urgency replaced with uncertainty as she observed the shift unfolding in real time. Richard exhaled slowly, then leaned slightly forward, placing both hands on the edge of the table. "Seen them where?" he asked, his voice lower than before, stripped of its earlier authority. Olivia looked down briefly at the ring again, then back up at him. "In the same place as everything else," she said, "with the things that were not supposed to be forgotten." The phrase lingered in the air between them. Richard's gaze tightened slightly, not in anger, but in focus, as if he was trying to map meaning onto something that refused to stay abstract. "That storage room," he said slowly, more to himself than to her. Olivia nodded again. "It is not just a room," she said. "It is a place where things were left when no one came back for them." The words carried a weight that seemed to settle deeper with each sentence. Richard straightened slightly, his attention shifting momentarily toward the glass walls of the room, where the gala continued outside as if nothing had changed. The contrast between the two spaces felt increasingly distant, almost unreal. When he turned back to Olivia, his voice was quieter than before. "You are not just a visitor there," he said, more like a realization than a question. Olivia did not respond immediately. Instead, she took a small step closer to the table again, her eyes steady. "I did not go there by accident," she said. Richard studied her for a long moment, the earlier confusion in his expression now replaced by something far more complex. The assistant shifted slightly but remained silent, sensing that any interruption would break something fragile that was still forming. Richard's gaze dropped once more to the ring, then to the letter, then back to Olivia. "Why are you really here?" he asked finally, his voice no longer defensive, but searching. Olivia paused for a brief moment, then spoke with quiet certainty. "Because you are not the only one who remembers," she said. The sentence landed with a stillness that felt heavier than anything before it. Richard did not respond immediately. For the first time since the evening began, he appeared not as a man controlling a situation, but as someone standing at the edge of understanding something he had spent years unknowingly approaching. The room remained perfectly still, holding its breath around them, as the distance between past and present continued to dissolve without warning or permission. The silence inside the private room of the Whitmore Foundation Gala now felt almost irreversible, as if every word spoken had carved itself into the space between Richard Whitmore and Olivia Carter. The ring and the letter still rested on the glass table, side by side, like two fragments of a story that had been separated for too long and were finally forced into the same frame again. Richard remained standing, but his posture had changed noticeably. The rigid control he had maintained since the beginning of the evening was no longer intact in the same way, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain, and far more human. Olivia stood across from him, her small figure steady, her expression unchanged, as if she had already accepted that what was about to happen could no longer be stopped. Richard finally spoke again, his voice slower now, no longer shaped by authority but by something closer to hesitation. "You said I am not the only one who remembers," he said carefully, as if testing the sentence before allowing it to fully exist in the room. Olivia nodded once. "You are not," she replied. The assistant near the doorway shifted slightly, still silent, her presence now more observational than interventive, as though she understood that anything she said would no longer matter in the direction this moment was taking. Richard looked down at the table again, his eyes moving between the ring and the letter. "Who else remembers?" he asked quietly. Olivia did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the table, her gaze fixed on the objects as if they were guiding her response rather than the other way around. "The person who wrote those letters," she said finally. Richard's expression tightened slightly. "That is not possible," he said, though the certainty in his voice had weakened compared to earlier. Olivia looked up at him again. "It is possible," she said, "because she never forgot you." The words settled into the room with a weight that neither the silence nor the distance between them could soften. Richard turned slightly away, his hand brushing the edge of the table, as if he needed physical contact with something stable to remain composed. For a brief moment, his attention drifted again, not outward but inward, as if the words had unlocked something he had long kept sealed. He exhaled slowly, then spoke again, his voice lower. "You are talking about someone from a long time ago," he said. Olivia nodded. "Yes," she replied, "but time does not change what was written." Richard closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them, looking at her with a different kind of focus now. "Why are you bringing this to me now?" he asked. Olivia's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Because the box was never meant to stay closed," she said. Richard stared at her for a long moment, then slowly shifted his attention back to the letter on the table. His fingers moved slightly closer to it but stopped again before making contact, as if he was still uncertain whether touching it would confirm something he was not yet ready to fully face. Behind him, the assistant finally spoke again, more cautiously this time. "Sir, if this involves personal history, we should proceed with discretion and proper review," she said. But Richard did not respond. Instead, he remained focused on the objects in front of him, his voice quieter than before when he finally spoke again. "Where is she now?" he asked. Olivia looked at him directly, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in her expression, not uncertainty, but something closer to resolve. "She never left," Olivia said softly. The room fell into a deeper silence, one that no longer felt like absence of sound, but presence of truth finally reaching a place it had been waiting for. Richard Whitmore stood still, no longer trying to control the moment, as the realization he had been avoiding began to take shape in front of him without permission, without delay, and without any possibility of remaining hidden. The private room at the Whitmore Foundation Gala felt as though it had stopped belonging to time itself, suspended in a silence so complete that even the distant sounds of music and celebration outside the glass walls seemed unreachable. Richard Whitmore stood near the table where the ring and the letter still rested side by side, no longer as separate objects but as connected fragments of something he had not yet fully named. Olivia Carter remained across from him, her small figure steady, her presence calm in a way that contrasted sharply with the unraveling tension in the room. Richard's gaze lingered on her for a long moment before he finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier resistance. "You said she never left," he repeated slowly, as if trying to confirm the meaning of what he had just heard. Olivia nodded once. "She did not," she said. Richard exhaled through his nose, then shifted his attention back to the table. His hand moved slightly closer to the letter but stopped again just before touching it. "Then where is she?" he asked. Olivia did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the ring, then at the letter, as if both objects were part of the same answer. "She is in everything you left behind," she said softly. The words created a subtle shift in Richard's expression. It was not shock in the traditional sense, but something more internal, like a realization slowly forcing its way through layers of control and denial. Behind him, his assistant finally broke her silence again, her voice cautious but more uncertain than before. "Sir, if this is about a past relationship or unresolved personal matter, we should involve proper channels before continuing this conversation," she said. Richard raised his hand slightly without turning around, signaling her to stop once more. She hesitated, then fell silent again. Olivia stepped closer to the table, now standing just a short distance from Richard. "You do not need channels," she said. "You need the truth." Richard turned his head slightly toward her, studying her more carefully now. "And you believe you are the one bringing it to me?" he asked. Olivia met his gaze directly. "I am not bringing it," she said. "I am returning it." The sentence hung in the air with a weight that neither sound nor movement could soften. Richard slowly straightened, his posture shifting again, not back into authority, but into something more vulnerable and uncertain. He looked at the ring once more, then at the letter, and for the first time his hand moved forward without stopping. This time he picked up the letter. The paper felt fragile between his fingers, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment to be opened again. He did not read it immediately. Instead, he simply held it, staring at the handwriting as if trying to reconstruct a memory that had been partially erased by time and silence. Olivia watched him closely, not speaking, not moving, only observing. Richard finally lowered himself into the chair behind the table, as if the act of sitting was the only way to steady what was happening inside him. The assistant remained near the doorway, now fully silent, aware that the situation had moved beyond anything procedural or professional. Richard unfolded the letter slowly. His eyes scanned the first lines, and in that moment, something in his expression changed again, not dramatically, but unmistakably. A quiet recognition, followed by something that resembled disbelief softened by time. He exhaled slowly, lowering the letter slightly but not letting it go. "This was written years ago," he said quietly. Olivia nodded. "Yes," she replied, "but it was never answered." Richard looked up at her again, and for the first time since the beginning of the evening, his voice carried something closer to emotion than control. "Why you?" he asked. Olivia paused briefly, then answered in a voice just as steady as before. "Because I am the one who found what you stopped looking for." The room fell into a stillness that no longer felt like tension but transition, as if something irreversible had finally begun to move forward after being frozen for far too long. Richard Whitmore remained seated, holding the letter, no longer certain where the present ended and the past had begun again. The private room at the Whitmore Foundation Gala had shifted into a stillness so profound that it no longer felt like part of the event outside, but like a sealed world built entirely around the moment unfolding between Richard Whitmore, Olivia Carter, and the fragile pieces of the past now resting on the glass table. Richard remained seated, holding the letter in his hands, his eyes moving across the handwritten lines more slowly now, as if each word required time to settle into meaning. Olivia stood a few feet away, watching him carefully, her expression unchanged but her presence carrying a quiet certainty that no longer needed explanation. The assistant remained near the doorway, no longer attempting to intervene, her attention now fully absorbed by what she was witnessing. Richard finally lowered the letter slightly, his voice breaking the silence in a way that felt heavier than before. "She never stopped writing," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. Olivia did not respond immediately. Instead, she took a slow step forward, stopping just short of the table. "She never stopped waiting," she corrected softly. The words landed with a weight that made the air feel even denser. Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment, then reopened them, staring down at the letter again. His grip tightened slightly, not out of force, but out of something closer to restraint. "Why would she give this to you?" he asked, his voice no longer firm but searching. Olivia tilted her head slightly. "Because she knew you would not open it alone," she said. The simplicity of her answer carried more impact than any explanation. Richard slowly set the letter back onto the table, his hand lingering for a second before withdrawing. He leaned back slightly in his chair, as if trying to create distance from the weight of what he was now holding. Behind him, his assistant finally spoke again, her tone softer than before. "Sir, perhaps we should pause and revisit this later when you are ready," she said. But Richard shook his head slightly. "There is no later for this," he replied quietly. His eyes returned to Olivia. "Who is she?" he asked again, but this time the question felt different. It was no longer about identification. It was about recognition. Olivia looked at him for a long moment before answering. "She is the reason the box existed," she said. Richard's expression shifted subtly, not in disbelief, but in the slow acceptance of something he had avoided naming for far too long. The room behind them, visible through the glass wall, continued to move with distant life, guests unaware that inside this smaller space, Something irreversible was unfolding. Richard finally stood again, slower this time, as if the act required more effort than before. He looked down at the ring, then at the letter, then back at Olivia. "If everything you are saying is true," he said carefully, "then why now?" Olivia did not hesitate. "Because she is running out of time to be remembered properly," she said. The sentence did not carry drama or urgency in its tone, but it struck deeper than anything before it. Richard turned slightly away, placing a hand on the edge of the table for support, his composure no longer fully intact. For a brief moment he said nothing. The silence that followed was no longer empty, but filled with the weight of everything that had been uncovered and everything still waiting to be understood. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower than before. "Take me to her," he said. Olivia looked at him for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The assistant shifted slightly, as if about to speak, but stopped herself. Richard Whitmore stood between the ring, the letter, and the child who had carried both into his life without warning. And for the first time since the beginning of the evening, he was no longer in control of where the next step would lead. The private room inside the Whitmore Foundation Gala felt heavier than ever, as if the air itself had condensed around Richard Whitmore the moment he said the words asking to be taken to her. Olivia Carter stood still for a brief second, studying him carefully, as though confirming that his decision was real and not another attempt to escape what had already been uncovered. The ring and the letter remained on the glass table behind them, untouched now, yet still shaping everything that followed. Richard slowly straightened his posture, his voice no longer uncertain but stripped down to something quieter and more final. "Take me to her," he repeated, as if anchoring himself to the sentence. Olivia nodded once, then turned slightly toward the doorway. The assistant near the entrance shifted uncomfortably, stepping forward half a pace. "Sir, the gala is still ongoing and your schedule after this event is secured for the next meeting block," she said cautiously, attempting to reintroduce structure into a moment that had already moved beyond it. Richard did not look at her. "Cancel everything," he said calmly. The assistant hesitated, as if waiting for clarification that did not come. Then she lowered her gaze and stepped back. Olivia moved first, leading the way out of the private room. Richard followed a few steps behind her, his pace steady but different now, no longer driven by control but by something closer to inevitability. As they exited into the corridor leading away from the main ballroom, the sound of the gala faded behind them, replaced by quieter, more distant echoes of movement and light. Olivia walked without looking back, guiding him through a series of hallways that extended beyond the public sections of the building. Richard noticed details he would have normally ignored: the shift in lighting, the emptiness of certain corridors, the absence of sound where there should have been presence. None of it felt accidental anymore. They reached a side exit that opened toward a quieter section of the building, away from the main entrance and the crowd of guests. Outside, the night air was cooler, carrying the faint hum of the city in the distance. Olivia stopped near a waiting car that had been positioned discreetly along the curb. Richard paused behind her, observing everything in silence for a moment before speaking. "How far is she?" he asked. Olivia turned slightly. "Not far," she said. He opened the door for her without hesitation, then stepped in after her. The car began to move smoothly through the city streets, leaving behind the bright structure of the gala and entering quieter roads lined with muted light. Inside the vehicle, neither of them spoke at first. Richard sat with his hands loosely together, his gaze occasionally shifting toward Olivia but always returning to the passing streets outside the window. The letter was no longer in his hands, but its presence remained unchanged, as if it had been absorbed into his thoughts instead. After several minutes, Olivia finally broke the silence. "You will need to be ready," she said softly. Richard looked at her. "Ready for what?" he asked. Olivia did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked forward, watching the road ahead. "For the part of your life you stopped believing still existed," she said. The words settled between them without resistance. Richard leaned back slightly in his seat, exhaling slowly as the city lights passed in steady rhythm outside. For the first time that evening, he did not try to interpret or control what was coming next. He simply listened to the silence, allowing it to carry him forward toward a place he had not yet seen, but somehow already feared and recognized at the same time. The car slowed as it left the main streets of Manhattan, moving deeper into quieter neighborhoods where the glow of the city became softer and more distant. Inside, Richard Whitmore sat in silence beside Olivia Carter, his gaze fixed on the passing lights outside the window, though his thoughts were no longer anchored to the present. The conversation they had left behind at the gala still echoed faintly in his mind, but it was no longer fragmented. It was beginning to connect. Olivia remained calm, her hands resting in her lap, her expression unchanged, as if she had already accepted the weight of what was about to happen. The driver turned onto a narrower street, then slowed again in front of a modest building that stood apart from the polished architecture Richard was accustomed to. There were no bright lights, no signs of celebration, only a quiet entrance framed by a small covered walkway. Olivia stepped out first. Richard followed. The night air felt different here, still and unembellished, carrying no trace of the gala or the world he had just left behind. Olivia walked toward the entrance without hesitation. Richard paused for only a moment before following her inside. The hallway was dimly lit, simple and quiet, with the kind of stillness that suggested it was not meant for attention. Olivia stopped at a closed door near the end of the corridor. She turned slightly toward him. "She is inside," she said softly. Richard did not move immediately. For a brief moment, he simply stood there, as if the final step required acknowledgement rather than motion. Then he nodded once. Olivia opened the door. The room beyond was small, softly lit by a single lamp near the window. In the corner, seated quietly, was a woman who looked up slowly as the door opened. The moment her eyes met Richard's, everything in the room changed without sound. Richard froze, not in shock that was visible, but in recognition that was immediate and deeply internal. His breath caught slightly, and for a moment he did not step forward. The woman did not speak at first. Her gaze remained steady, though there was something in it that carried years of distance, waiting, and silence. Olivia stepped slightly to the side, remaining near the doorway but no longer intervening. The space between Richard and the woman felt both impossibly small and infinitely heavy. Finally, Richard took a slow step forward. His voice, when it came, was quiet and uncertain in a way no one had heard from him that night. "It is really you," he said. The woman did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment, then lowered her eyes briefly before speaking. "You were not supposed to come looking," she said softly. Richard exhaled slowly, as if the words carried more meaning than their surface allowed. "I did not know I stopped," he replied. A faint shift moved through the room, not dramatic, but undeniable. Olivia remained still, watching without interruption, as if her role had finally reached its conclusion. The woman finally stood, slowly, not with hesitation but with calm acceptance. "You left everything in that box," she said. "But some things do not stay there." Richard looked down briefly, then back at her. "I thought time would make it easier," he admitted quietly. The woman shook her head slightly. "Time only makes it quieter," she said. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of everything that had been avoided, preserved, and finally uncovered. Richard did not speak again immediately. Instead, he simply stood in the presence of what he had once chosen to leave behind, realizing that nothing about it had ever truly disappeared, only waited.